Liz, are you sure you want to take that risk? Her executive producer, Michael Drake, tapped his stylus nervously on his tablet. Trump is not the kind of guy you want to play cat and mouse with. Drake shook his head. Over the years, he had grown accustomed to Elizabeth's self-assurance, her ruthless interviewing style, and her uncanny ability to find her interviewees' weak spots. She was a ratings gladiator, and she enjoyed spilling blood on the sands of the modern media arena. Have you seen the latest analysis from our researchers? She asked, checking her phone for notifications. Trump's marriage is a perfect target, especially now that conservatives are making a fuss about traditional family values again. Yes, and that's why I'm worried, Drake lowered his voice, even though they were alone in the room. If you screw up the heck with your questions about Melania, he could turn this interview into your own execution. Remember what happened to Morgan's last year? Elizabeth waved her hand as if swatting away an annoying fly. Morganson was an amateur. He approached the topic head-on. She carefully adjusted the earpiece. I'll be like poison ivy, slowly wrapping myself around him before he realizes he's suffocating. The American Dialogue Studio was a masterpiece of modern design. Chrome surfaces, blue-lit glass panels, giant screens with constantly changing visuals, all created the impression that the viewer was peering into the future. But this cold splendor had its own trap. It made many guests feel uncomfortable, knocked out of their comfort zone, which gave the host an added advantage. But Donald Trump, who walked into the studio at exactly 7:47 p.m., seemed oblivious to this architectural psychology. He moved with the same confidence as if he were in his Trump Tower penthouse. Elizabeth, he said, shaking her hand firmly, you know, I always appreciate the opportunity to talk to Americans directly, without filters. Even if those filters, he glanced around the studio, looked so impressive. Assistants bustled around them, attaching microphones, checking lighting. Trump allowed a makeup artist to apply the minimal makeup necessary for the high-definition cameras, but refused to try to smooth out his famous hair. The audience is used to seeing me like this, he said with that cocky grin that millions of Americans either loved or hated. Elizabeth sank gracefully into the chair across from Trump, mentally going over the interview plan. Their research team, including 2 political analysts and a psychologist, had developed a step-by-step strategy. Start with easy questions about business, create a false sense of security, then ease into policy decisions, and then hit the personal, where every word is potentially dangerous. I hope you're ready for a serious conversation, she said, hiding her true intentions behind the mask of a professional journalist. Always ready, Trump said, settling into his chair with the air of a man who has negotiated with world leaders and knows the value of every word. The question is, are your viewers ready to hear the truth, and not the version that CNN usually gives them? It was a challenge thrown down before the interview had even begun, and Elizabeth felt the thrill of the chase ignite within her. You think you're ready, she thought, but I'm going to spend a lot of audience nerves tonight to prove you're not. 30 seconds, the director commanded. The studio audience, carefully selected to create a balanced representation, though Elizabeth knew the producers had favored people with more liberal views, grew quiet in anticipation. 10 seconds. The cameras floated smoothly along the rails, approaching the presenter and her guest. 3, 2, 1. Good evening, America. Elizabeth's voice sounded with the intonation honed by years of practice, confident but warm. Today on the American Dialogue, a man who never shies away from tough questions, a man whose name evokes the strongest emotions on both sides of the political spectrum, the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. The camera switched to Trump, who nodded slightly in greeting. Thank you for the invitation, Elizabeth. It's always a pleasure to be in a place where you can speak the truth to the American people. We will definitely talk about the truth today, Mr. Trump. Elizabeth switched to an informal tone, creating the illusion of a confidential conversation. Let's start with what interests many of our viewers. You built a business empire, became president, changed the political landscape of America. What do you think is the secret of your success? It was a classic softball question, a question that allows the other person to relax, to feel safe. Trump accepted the rules of the game, or at least pretended to. You know, Elizabeth, there is no secret, just hard work, strategic thinking, and the ability to see opportunities where others see problems. He made a characteristic hand gesture. When I started in real estate, a lot of people said New York was in decline, that it was hopeless. But I saw the future. I saw potential. Same thing with America. When I decided to run, experts like the ones on your channel said I had no chance. But the American people saw what the experts didn't. And yet, Elizabeth continued, taking the first cautious step toward her true goal, critics say you started with a serious advantage, with millions from your father. Not every American has that starting position. Trump didn't show irritation, although there was a spark in his eyes. He already knew where she was going. You're right, I got a great start. But do you know how many people make millions and lose them? Lots. Turning a million into a billion is like turning $1 into 1,000. The only difference is the zeros. But the principle is the same. You have to work smarter, not be afraid to take risks, and always, always keep your word. Elizabeth made a note in her notes, although she remembered the interview plan perfectly well. Keeping your word is really important, she said in a tone that might have seemed sincere to the uninitiated, especially when it comes to serious promises, like the ones we make in our personal relationships. It was the first hint, the first turn in the conversation toward Trump's personal life. Over a century of television, viewers have learned to sense such moments, when a conversation is about to move from neutral to personal, from safe to dangerous. Trump tilted his head slightly, like a bird of prey assessing movement below. Absolutely right, Elizabeth. Promises are the foundation not only of business, but of our entire civilization. When I promised Americans jobs, I kept that promise. When I promised to strengthen the borders, I did it. In my personal life, the principle is the same. It's interesting that you mentioned your personal life. Elizabeth pretended that this was a natural continuation of her interlocutor's thoughts and not her own strategy. After all, for many, you embody the American dream not only in business, but also in personal terms. A beautiful wife, successful children, the external attributes of success. But some wonder, is happiness something that can be bought or built, like a skies rubbisher? There was a barely perceptible pause in the studio. The audience, as if sensing the approach of conflict, leaned forward. In Elizabeth's earpiece, Drake's voice came through. Careful, Liz. He knows where you're going with this. You know what's interesting about your question, Elizabeth? The way you try to create a false dichotomy, as if business success and personal happiness are mutually exclusive. He paused. Or as if my family happiness is some kind of commercial project. But the truth is, real happiness can't be bought. You can build the conditions for it, you can work on it, but it comes from within, from relationships, from trust. You talk about trust. She paused pointedly. An interesting choice of word for someone whose family relationships have often been the subject of public debate, especially given how different you and Melania seem. There it was. The name was spoken. Melania. With that very intonation that seemed to add invisible quotation marks to the name. Trump sat up straight in his chair. His face didn't change, but something in his posture suggested he had accepted the challenge. Different? He asked with a slight grin. Is that a euphemism for something specific, Elizabeth? Perhaps you could tell me exactly what you mean? It was a counterattack. It forced her to be more direct than she had planned at this point in the interview. What? Trump interrupted, his voice taking on the famous steely edge that made debate opponents lose their cool. A marriage that your analysts would approve of? Or a marriage that CNN viewers would approve of? Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. He hadn't just parried her attack, he'd gone on the offensive, using her very weapon. I'm just voicing the questions that interest our viewers. She tried to regain the initiative. After all, public figures are still people, Elizabeth. His voice was suddenly soft, which only emphasized the strength of the conviction behind it. And you know what's interesting? The very people who shout the loudest about racial diversity and acceptance of different cultures somehow feel the need to criticize a marriage where a woman from another country with a different culture brings her own character, her own traditions to it. There was some applause in the studio. Elizabeth glanced quickly at the audience, and she didn't like what she saw. Several people were nodding in agreement with Trump. She had to seize the initiative, and fast. I'm not talking about cultural differences, Mr. Trump. I'm talking about the fact that many people perceive your marriage as, well, transactional. A beautiful young model and a rich businessman. A classic story, right? As she spoke, she knew she had crossed the line Drake had warned her about. She heard his panicked whisper in the earpiece. Liz, don't! It's too early! But it was too late. Trump was silent for a second. 2, 3. The longest seconds of Elizabeth Montgomery's television career. An expression she couldn't decipher flitted across his face. Was it anger? Or pity? Transactional, he repeated finally as if tasting the word. I wonder where this view of relationships comes from. Is it a projection? Is it possible that in the world of Manhattan, elites and the Washington establishment, marriages are actually structured as business deals? He paused and Elizabeth swallowed involuntarily. Something in his tone suggested that his next words would be like the crack of a whip. But you know what I've noticed in my life? Trump continued, leaning forward slightly. People judge others by their own standards. If a person thinks it's okay to cheat in business, he thinks everyone else is cheating. If a politician takes bribes, he thinks all politicians are corrupt. And if someone sees marriage as a benefit, he didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The implicit accusation hung in the air. Elizabeth felt her face begin to burn beneath her flawless makeup. It was unexpected. Not anger, not indignation, but this calm, almost philosophical response that made her, not him, look cynical. You're avoiding the question, she tried to get back on the offensive. The fact is that your wife is much younger than you. She was a model, and many people perceive this as... Many people? Trump interrupted. Or the editors of CNN. Or maybe those same elites who think ordinary Americans are too stupid to understand that real relationships aren't built on what the tabloids write. Okay, let's be blunt, she said, putting aside her notes as if she no longer needed prepared questions. Does it strike you as odd that the woman you call your closest ally is so rarely seen with you in public? That her voice is so silent on issues you consider important? That so many Americans see her as a pretty statue rather than a real person with her own views? Trump looked at her with an expression that could almost be called sympathetic. You know, Elizabeth, there's a difference between being loud and being heard, he said finally. Melania speaks when she feels like it. She chooses her words with a wisdom that many in Washington could learn from. And most important, she speaks from the heart, not from a teleprompter. There was a note of real passion in his voice, and Elizabeth realized with surprise that he meant it. This was not a prepared answer or political rhetoric. This was something personal. You know what's really sad, Trump continued, speaking less to her than to the camera, directly to the millions watching, is that in our culture, we've become so accustomed to loudmouths, to people who constantly demand attention, that quiet strength and dignity seem suspect. We've become so mired in noise that we've forgotten the value of silence. Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. The interview that was supposed to be her triumph, an exposure of Trump, was turning into something else entirely. He wasn't defending himself. He was attacking the very nature of modern media culture, and doing so with unexpected poetry. She had to take back control. Now. The studio was completely silent. Even the cameraman, accustomed to the provocative questions of American dialogue, froze, stunned by the directness of the attack. In Elizabeth's earpiece, Drake's panicked voice rang out. God darn it, Liz, are you crazy? But she wasn't listening. Elizabeth's eyes were glued to Trump's face, waiting for the famous Trumpian anger to flare, preparing to counter his outrage with prepared phrases about a free press and the public's right to know the truth. But no anger followed. Instead, Trump's face broke into the same smile that usually preceded his most devastating counterattacks in political debates. More modern, he repeated, and there was a whole philosophy in those two words. You know what, Elizabeth? You've just summed up the problem of our society perfectly. He paused, and Elizabeth realized she had fallen into a trap. Not him, but she. The interview, intended as a luxury trap for Trump, had become a trap for the hunter herself. He made a sweeping gesture, as if embracing an invisible audience outside the studio. You know what I think? I think the millions of Americans who get up before dawn every day to provide for their families, who remain faithful to their spouses not because of, but in spite of, everything that modern culture promotes, these people understand something that is not understood in the glass towers of Manhattan, or in the studios of CNN. Mr. Trump, she tried to interject, but he raised his hand to stop her, and to her surprise, she complied. No, let me finish, he said with such authority that no one had any doubt who was now in control of the conversation. You asked me if I had ever thought about a more modern woman. Let me answer you frankly, no, never. And do you know why? He paused, and Elizabeth suddenly found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. A voice from the back of the audience called out, Tell them, Donald. Elizabeth cast a withering glance in that direction, but it was too late. The ice had broken. Elizabeth felt her heart beat faster. She knew she should stop this sermon, take back control of the interview, but all her prepared lines suddenly seemed empty and out of place. But Elizabeth didn't seem to hear. She was looking at Trump, at his face, which now radiated not aggression, but some kind of inner strength, the unshakable confidence of a man who knows he is defending something truly important. And in that moment, a cold, terrified realization gripped her. She was not just losing control of the interview, she was losing a battle that viewers had no idea was happening. A battle between media cynicism and the simple truth that Trump had just so clearly expressed. You mentioned vows, Mr. Trump, Elizabeth said, making a last desperate attempt to regain control of the conversation. These are the same vows you made to your previous wives. Don't you think there's a certain contradiction? Trump looked her straight in the eye, And in that moment, something changed in the dynamics of their confrontation. He was no longer parrying her blows. He was looking at her with an almost paternal sadness, as if she were a person who had never understood something important in life. You know, Elizabeth. His voice was quieter, but only more heartfelt. I've made mistakes. Lots of mistakes. And I've paid a price for each one. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. But the difference between you and me is that I learn from my mistakes, and I don't exploit other people's mistakes to boost my ratings. And while you're preparing your next poisonous question, millions of Americans are looking at their families and thinking, yeah, he's right. Real value isn't youth or fame or big words. It's loyalty. It's standing up for each other when the world is against you. And you know what? They're right. The commercial break in the CNN studio lasted only 90 seconds. But for Elizabeth Montgomery, those 90 seconds seemed like an eternity. In a small technical room behind the main studio, executive producer Michael Drake paced like a cornered animal. Elizabeth stood in front of the mirror as the makeup artist hurriedly touched up her makeup. Her hands, usually so confident, were shaking slightly. He was too well prepared, she muttered, like he knew what questions I would ask. You're not wrong, Liz, Drake almost shouted. Of course he knew. He's Donald fucking Trump. He's been dealing with the media sharks for decades. You thought you could just corner him. The makeup artist moved aside, and Elizabeth turned to the producer. Something new flashed in her eyes, usually cold and calculating, a mixture of uncertainty and determination. I have a trump card, she said quietly. Something he's definitely not ready for. Drake froze. Liz, don't you dare. We discussed this. There is a line that can't be crossed. We're in the media business, Mike. Her voice hardened. There are no devils here, only ratings, and today they'll be ours. Elizabeth headed back to the studio, but Drake grabbed her arm. If you do this, you'll do more than cross a line, he whispered. You'll burn bridges, not just with him, but with half of America. Elizabeth gently but firmly pulled her hand free. When Elizabeth returned to the studio, Trump was already sitting in his chair, as confident and collected as before the break. Only there was something new in his eyes, the wariness of a predator who senses a trap. Welcome back to American Conversation, Elizabeth said, her voice impeccably professional as the cameras rolled back. We continue our conversation with the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. Mr. Trump, before the break, we talked about what true value means in relationships. Exactly, Trump nodded, leaning forward slightly. And I'd like to continue on that topic if you don't mind. Of course, Elizabeth smiled with the same smile that her colleagues called the smile of a great white shark behind her back. But first, let me quote you. Before the break, you said that the real value is loyalty, standing up for each other when the whole world is against you. Did I understand you correctly? Absolutely, Trump nodded with the confidence of a man who knows his words resonate with millions of Americans on the other side of the screen. Trump's eyes narrowed slightly. Despite his outward calm, there was a dangerous edge to his voice. But Elizabeth was not about to back down. Let's get something straight, Trump interrupted, his voice now taking on a steely edge. You're sitting here pretending to be an objective journalist, but you're actually repeating trashy tabloid gossip. Is that what CNN has become under your leadership? I'm just asking questions that our viewers are interested in, Mr. Trump. She kept her tone professional, but there was a predatory glint in her eyes. And if we're talking about family values, about loyalty, isn't it fair to also discuss those moments when those values may not have been the first priority? What moments? Trump leaned forward, and the temperature in the studio seemed to drop a few degrees. Elizabeth took a deep breath. She knew the next words could cost her career, but it was too late to back out. Let's say the Stormy Daniels thing, she said with feigned casualness, as if she were referring to the weather outside, rather than one of the most scandalous episodes of his presidency. The studio was dead silent. The audience held its breath. Elizabeth heard Drake's muffled groan in her earpiece, but she ignored it. Her eyes were fixed on Trump's face, waiting for a flash of anger that she could use to finally seize the initiative. But there was no anger. Instead, Trump leaned back in his chair and smiled. It wasn't his usual big, camera-ready grin, but something more complex, a mixture of disappointment and almost regret. Now we come to the point, he said finally, his voice unexpectedly soft. Why you actually invited me on this show? Elizabeth felt a sudden sense of dismay. This was not the reaction she had hoped for. He should have been defensive, justified, perhaps even lashed out. Instead, he seemed almost sympathetic? I invited you to ask questions that interest our viewers. She tried to return to her script. No, Elizabeth. Trump shook his head. You invited me to create a moment, a viral clip that goes viral on social media. Watch how CNN anchor corners Trump. That's not journalism. That's show business. He paused, letting his words sink in. And you know what's most ironic? You mentioned a story that became public many years ago. A story for which I have already paid a price. In court, in the media, in the public eye. A story that you bring up not because it's new or important, but because you hope to use it to create a contradiction between my words about family values and past mistakes. Elizabeth opened her mouth to object, but Trump raised his hand. Let me finish, he said with such authority that she couldn't help but obey. Yes, I've made mistakes. Lots of them. Like most people. The difference is that my mistakes make headlines. And you know what's most amazing? That through it all, Melania has stuck by my side. Not because she's a victim or an addict, as your pundits like to say, but because she believes that people can change, grow, become better. Something in his words sounded so sincere that even the most skeptical viewers in the studio listened with genuine attention. Elizabeth felt the ground slipping from under her. She had planned to corner him, to force him to justify himself, but instead he was turning her own attack into a platform for a speech that could be given at the Republican National Convention. Mr. Trump, she tried to seize the initiative. I think many of our viewers would like to hear more specific answers rather than general discussions about what, Elizabeth? Trump interrupted. About real life? About real relationships that are not always perfect, but are built on forgiveness, understanding, and loyalty? Or do you think your viewers live in some perfect world where no one makes mistakes? There was a hardness in his voice. Not the anger, but rather the passion of a man speaking out about what he truly believed in. You know what strikes me most about today's culture? He continued. It's how quick people are to judge others for past mistakes. It's as if a person is a frozen snapshot rather than a story of growth and development. Some of the loudest voices judging others for past mistakes would not stand up to the same scrutiny on their own lives. He paused, and the studio was so quiet you could hear the ventilation. And here's the irony. The same media that denounced me for the mistakes of 10 years ago are, in other situations, the first to shout about rehabilitation, second chances, and forgiveness. But for some reason, these principles do not apply to those whose political views they disagree with. A strange coincidence, don't you think? Elizabeth felt her face flush. She had come to this interview with a clear plan, to use Trump's past scandals to undermine his moral authority. Instead, he was turning her own tactics against her, and doing so with surprising skill. Let's get back to the Melania question, she tried to seize control. You talk about loyalty, about fidelity, but don't you think the real reason she stays with you might be more pragmatic? Trump raised an eyebrow. Pragmatic? He said the word with a slight grin. Interesting. And what do you think this pragmatic reason is? Elizabeth knew she was entering dangerous territory, but it was too late to retreat. Well, let's say financial stability, she shrugged, as if it were the most obvious explanation in the world. Status, social standing, all the perks that come with being married to a former president and a billionaire. There were a few outraged gasps in the studio. Elizabeth glanced quickly at the audience and was surprised to see that even some of the people she knew as liberals looked shocked by her outspokenness. Trump looked at her for a few seconds, and there was something in his gaze that made her cringe inwardly. Not anger, but some deep, almost philosophical disappointment. You know, Elizabeth, he said at last. And there was a note in his voice she had never heard before, a mixture of compassion and hard truth. Your question says a lot more about you than it does about me or Melania. What do you mean? Elizabeth tried to remain professional, but she felt anxiety growing inside her. I mean, when a person views a relationship only through the prism of benefits, through the prism of what can I get instead of what can I give, it says something about their own worldview, Trump said slowly, weighing each word. Melania is a successful woman who built her career long before she met me. She is educated, speaks 5 languages, and has had a successful business. The idea that she needs me for financial stability or status is not only insulting, it shows a profound misunderstanding of who she really is. He paused, letting his words sink in. But that's not even the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is how much the rhetoric about women has changed depending on their political views. If a woman with liberal views chooses to stay in a difficult relationship, she is called strong, decisive, devoted. If a conservative woman does the same, she is called dependent, a victim, or calculating. A funny coincidence, isn't it? Elizabeth felt her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was losing control of the interview, that Trump was not just parrying her attacks, but turning them into an opportunity for his own talking points, ones that resonated even with an audience that was initially hostile to him. Mr. Trump, she tried to change her tack. Nobody disputes Melania's accomplishments. The point is that many people perceive your marriage as, like what? Trump interrupted. Like it doesn't fit the progressive Manhattan idea of what a modern marriage should be? You know what I think? I think the real problem isn't that Melania and I don't fit any mold. The problem is that it demonstrates values that many in today's culture would rather forget. Loyalty, forgiveness, growth through adversity. He leaned forward, his voice becoming even more passionate. You know what's really weird, Elizabeth? That we live in a society that calls for understanding, for rejecting stereotypes, for respecting the personal choices of each person. But when it comes to a woman who doesn't fit into the progressive agenda, all of these principles suddenly stop working. Suddenly it becomes normal to discuss her motives, analyze her relationships, question her independence. Don't you find this hypocritical? A heavy silence fell over the studio. Elizabeth felt sweat beating on her forehead, despite the perfect air conditioning. What should have been her triumph was turning into a professional nightmare in front of millions of viewers. I'm just asking questions that interest our audience, she repeated her mantra, but her voice betrayed her. No, Elizabeth, Trump shook his head. You're pushing a narrative. You came into this interview with a prepared story. Trump is a hypocrite who talks about family values but doesn't live by them. And Melania is either a victim or a calculating status hog. And when reality doesn't fit that narrative, you try to make the facts fit your story, not the other way around. He leaned back in his chair, and there was something almost regal in his posture. Confident, relaxed, dominant. Elizabeth saw many in the audience nodding along with his words. She felt her control slipping away with each passing second. This was no longer an interview. It was a one-sided monologue in which she had turned from the hunter to the hunted. In a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, she went all in. Mr. Trump, her voice sharpened, all these fine words about devotion and loyalty sound wonderful. But admit it, have you ever thought about finding someone younger? When Melania starts to age, will all these high principles remain in place? The studio literally shook at her question. Someone in the audience gasped. Drake made a noise in his earpiece that sounded like a death rattle. Elizabeth knew she had just crossed every possible line of professional ethics. But her predatory instincts took over. She had to provoke a reaction, any reaction, that would give her back control. But Trump's reaction was completely unexpected. He just looked at her for a few long, unbearable seconds. Not with anger, not with indignation, but with some mixture of amazement and deep sadness, as if he had just witnessed something incredibly tragic. Find someone younger, he repeated at last. And there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet, almost thoughtful disappointment. You know, Elizabeth, there are things you can't explain to someone who sees relationships as purely transactional. Who thinks that people are commodities with a limited shelf life, to be replaced when they no longer meet the requirements? He paused, and the studio was so quiet you could hear hearts beating. But I'll try to explain, Trump continued, his voice deepening, richer. When you go through fire with another person, through loss, through victory, through betrayal and triumph, through sickness and health, you create something that can't be replicated with anyone else. It's not just shared memories. It's a shared soul story. He spoke now not only for Elizabeth, but for everyone who had ever loved, lost, forgiven, and begun again. When the whole world turned against us, when every morning began with a new attack, a new lie, a new attempt to destroy everything we had built, Melania was my fortress, not because she had to support me, but because she chose to. Every day she chose to stay, to fight, to believe. His voice became quieter, but that only made it more convincing. Are you asking if I'd like to find someone younger when Melania starts to get old? He shook his head as if he couldn't believe he'd even been asked that question. That's like asking a war veteran if he'd like to trade his comrade in arms for someone with a newer weapon, or asking someone who's been through a fire if he'd like to forget the people who pulled him out of the fire for more exciting connections. He made a sweeping gesture with his hand, encompassing the entire studio. Do you know what the real problem with our society is? It's not that people make mistakes. Mistakes are inevitable. The problem is the consumerist attitude toward life itself, toward relationships, toward people. It's the idea that everything can be updated, replaced, thrown away when it no longer meets requirements. As if people aren't souls, but smartphones that become obsolete with each new model. Elizabeth looked at him, suddenly realizing that her carefully laid plan was unraveling before her eyes. She had come to trap Trump in hypocrisy, but instead she had found herself naked in her cynicism before millions of viewers. But you're a businessman, she made a last desperate attempt. Isn't everything in business built on constant renewal, on the search for better options, on... That's the whole point, Elizabeth, Trump interrupted gently, and there was something like compassion in his voice now. People are not businesses. Relationships are not contracts. Love is not a transaction. And the fact that you can't tell the difference is the real tragedy. A silence fell over the studio, thick and heavy, like before a storm. Elizabeth could feel the gazes of dozens of people in the studio and millions beyond. Glances that expressed not just disagreement, but real condemnation. Not for her political views, but for something far more fundamental, her cynical attitude toward the deepest human connections. She had to say something, somehow wrest control, but the words were stuck in her throat. In her earpiece, Drake's voice was panicked. Commercial! We need commercials now! But Trump wasn't done. He leaned forward, his voice becoming more intimate, as if he were talking not to a controversial talk show host, but to a lost man. Liz, we're closing. His voice shook with barely contained panic. This is a disaster. We can blame technical problems and... No! Elizabeth Montgomery looked pale but determined. Her perfect makeup couldn't hide the feverish glint in her eyes. I'm not finished. I don't care, she snapped. He's not leaving here as a winner. I still have some trump cards. Drake looked at the presenter with despair. Liz, please, just wrap this up as neutrally as possible. Any further attacks will only make things worse. But in Elizabeth's eyes, there burned the fire of a man who was cornered and ready to fight to the last. 5 seconds. Drake looked away with a look of doom on his face, and Elizabeth turned to the camera with a professional smile that now seemed like a forced mask. Kyokun, welcome back to American Dialogue. We continue our conversation with the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. The camera switched to Trump, who looked completely calm, even relaxed, the complete opposite of Elizabeth's internal state. Mr. Trump, before the break, we talked about family values and how you understand them. She began with feigned ease. Let me ask you a direct question. If loyalty and constancy are so important to you, how do you explain the fact that Melania is your third wife? There were muffled gasps in the room. It was an obvious ploy, a last-ditch effort to corner Trump. But instead of looking annoyed or defensive, Trump merely smiled faintly, as if he had been expecting exactly this question. You know, Elizabeth, he began quietly, I appreciate that question. I really do. Because it allows us to talk about something very important, about growth, about change, about how a person learns from his mistakes. He paused as if collecting his thoughts. The words sounded simple, but there was some disarming sincerity in them. Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. Instead of being defensive or angry, Trump was turning her attack into an opportunity for another deep reflection that was sure to resonate with viewers. So you admit that you were wrong in your previous relationships? She tried to seize the initiative. I admit I was imperfect, Trump said without a shadow of a doubt. As is every person in this studio. As is every person watching us right now. The only difference is that my mistakes became tabloid headlines instead of remaining in the private sphere. He leaned forward and his voice deepened. You know what's interesting about modern culture? The way it simultaneously demands perfection and denies the possibility of growth. A person must either be flawless from the start or remain forever branded by their mistakes, especially if that person is a conservative. There were cheers from the audience. Elizabeth glanced quickly at the audience and was horrified to see that even those in the audience who had initially been anti-Trump were listening attentively to his words. Mr. Trump, she tried to get back on the offensive. It's one thing to talk about growth and change. It's another thing to be consistent in your actions. As someone who talks so loudly about family values, don't you see the contradiction in the fact that your own family history doesn't match those ideals? Excellent question, Trump nodded, clearly not intending to evade. Let me answer it with a story I rarely tell publicly. He paused and the studio fell silent. Even Elizabeth, despite her distaste, leaned forward. When I was a young businessman just starting out in New York, I was cocky, ambitious, and frankly, selfish. I thought success was measured only by money, deals, public recognition. I built buildings, but I didn't build relationships. His voice became quieter, more intimate. You know what the hardest thing for someone like me is to admit you were wrong? Not in a business decision, not in an investment, in the most fundamental understanding of what makes life meaningful. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to beat faster. This was not the Trump she had expected. Not aggressive, not defensive, but surprisingly reflective and open. He made a gesture with his hand as if embracing his entire life. The studio was so quiet you could hear the sound of breathing. Elizabeth felt her carefully crafted attack crashing into something far more powerful than mere political rhetoric. human sincerity. He looked directly into the camera, as if he were speaking not to Elizabeth, but to the millions of Americans watching the interview. And you know what's most surprising? That many of those who are now judging me for past mistakes in other situations are the first to talk about how important it is to give people a second chance. How important it is not to judge a person only by their past. How important it is to believe in the possibility of change and growth. He turned back to Elizabeth, and there was a strange mixture of firmness and compassion in his gaze. So yes, Elizabeth, I have had several marriages. I have made mistakes. I have not always lived up to the values I'm talking about now. But doesn't that make those values less important? Isn't personal experience, even when it includes failures, the most powerful teacher? Elizabeth felt something stir inside her. She had come to this interview expecting to encounter a cartoonish Trump, aggressive, defensive, maybe even rude. Instead, she was confronted by a man who spoke with such sincerity and depth that even her professional cynicism was beginning to crack. But she was too experienced a player to give up so easily. "Beautiful words, Mr. Trump," she said with a slight smile. "But isn't it convenient to talk about growth and change when talking about your own mistakes? Yet you are quite harsh in judging others for their failures." He paused and a tense silence fell over the studio. But there is a difference between judging a person for mistakes and judging actions or policies that affect millions of people. I can be a harsh critic of policies that I believe are hurting America. But that doesn't mean I don't believe in the possibility of personal growth for every person, including those with whom I disagree politically. Elizabeth felt her last hope of cornering him into a logical contradiction slipping away. He wasn't just parrying her blows. He was turning them into opportunities for even deeper reflection, which clearly resonated with the audience. In desperation, she decided to change tactics. It was a low blow, and Elizabeth knew it. She expected outrage, maybe even a tantrum. But Trump only smiled, calmly, almost tenderly. "You know, Elizabeth," he said, "that's the problem with our media culture. You take a few seconds out of thousands of hours of shared life and turn them into proof of an entire theory. You create a narrative and then you pick the facts to support it." He shook his head as if surprised at the naivety of such an approach. "Have you ever been in a long-term relationship?" he asked suddenly, and this personal question caught Elizabeth off guard. "We're not talking about me now," she retorted. "No, but it's important to understand," Trump insisted. "Anyone who's been in a long-term relationship knows that there are moments of frustration, moments of fatigue, moments when you're not in the mood to hold hands in public or smile for the cameras." He leaned forward, his voice becoming quieter, more confidential. "Melania is a very private person who has found herself in the most public position in the world. She is an immigrant who has become the first lady of a country where the very concepts of immigrant and foreigner have become politically charged. She is a woman whose every movement, every facial expression, every outfit is analyzed, discussed, criticized by millions of people." There was a note of real passion in his voice. "Do you think it's easy? Do you think anyone would be happy every second under that kind of pressure? And yet she carries herself with such dignity, with such grace, that even her critics are forced to admit it." Elizabeth felt her arguments crumble one by one. She had expected a politician willing to defend his image at any cost. Instead, she was faced with a man who spoke with such convincing humanity that even the most skeptical studio audience listened attentively. He glanced around the studio. "But of course, these moments don't make for such good headlines, do they? Trump and Melania look happy together. Who would click on that news?" A chuckle rippled through the room, and even Elizabeth felt the corners of her lips twitch involuntarily into a smile. Trump caught the moment and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a small victory. "Mr. Trump," she tried to return to a more assertive tone, "everything you say sounds wonderful, but the fact remains that your wife is much younger than you. She was a model. She is an immigrant. It all fits into a certain pattern." Trump raised an eyebrow. "Pattern?" he asked with a slight grin. "Interesting. And what pattern do you mean?" Elizabeth realized that she was entering dangerous territory, but it was too late to retreat. "Well, let's say this, a certain type of relationship, where a man chooses a woman primarily for her appearance and a woman for her status and financial situation." A heavy silence fell over the studio. Even the cameramen, accustomed to provocative questions, seemed to hold their breath. In Elizabeth's earpiece, Drake's voice sounded panicked. "What are you doing? Turn it off right now." But instead of the expected outburst of indignation, Trump did something completely unexpected. He laughed. Not an angry or sarcastic laugh, but a surprisingly good-natured, almost sympathetic laugh. "Oh, Elizabeth," he said, shaking his head. "You know what's saddest about your question? The way it exposes the prejudices that lurk behind the facade of progressive values." He sat up straighter in his chair and his voice became firmer. "Think about what you just said for a minute. You look at a successful woman, a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a polyglot, a first lady who has spoken to world leaders, and all you see is a model. You look at an immigrant who has achieved incredible success on her own, and you assume she's only with someone for the money." A murmur of approval swept through the audience. Elizabeth felt her face flush. Trump wasn't just parrying her attack, he was flipping the narrative, casting her, not himself, as the one with outdated, prejudiced views. "You know what's really offensive?" Trump continued, and now there was real passion in his voice. "It's not your questions about my marriage. It's the way you, under the guise of equality and respect for women, actually devalue a woman's achievements, intelligence, and character simply because she's beautiful and married to a man whose politics you don't like." "Mr. Trump," she tried to regain control of the situation, "I didn't mean to disparage Mrs. Trump's accomplishments in any way. I just—" "But you did," Trump said firmly. "You cited my marriage to Melania as proof of some pattern where a woman is only for her looks and a man is only for his money. You reduced a complex, deep, long-term connection between two people to some primitive transaction. And you know what's most interesting? That reduction says far more about your view of relationships than it does about our marriage." In a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, she decided to approach it from a different angle. She expected the question to catch him off guard, but Trump just smiled, not condescendingly, but as if he had been expecting exactly this turn of events. He shook his head as if surprised by such a narrow gaze. Elizabeth felt her final arguments crumble. Instead of defending himself, Trump defended Melania's right to be herself, and he did so with such conviction that even the most skeptical studio audience seemed to see the situation in a new light. "You know what I've noticed over the years in the public sphere?" Trump continued, looking around the room. "The way we've created a culture that values only loudness, only constant presence, only continuous expression of opinions, even when those opinions are merely echoes of what is considered right in certain circles." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But Melania has chosen a different path. She speaks when she really has something to say. She chooses projects that are truly important to her. Protecting children, fighting cyberbullying, supporting military families. And she does it not for the sake of headlines, not for the sake of media approval, but because she truly believes in these goals." But she quickly pushed those thoughts aside. She had a job to do, and that job was to ask tough questions, not to be swayed by the other person's eloquence. "Mr. Trump," she began again, but was suddenly interrupted by the sound of applause, which began first in the back rows of the studio and then spread throughout the room. Elizabeth turned to the audience in disbelief and saw several people standing up to applaud Trump. Within seconds, others joined in, and soon almost the entire room was standing. It was an unprecedented moment in the history of the American dialogue. An audience largely made up of people who had come to hear Trump put in his place instead expressed open support for his words. Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She cast a panicked glance toward the production booth, where Drake was making frantic gestures to go to commercial. But it was too late. The moment had acquired its own momentum that could not be stopped. Trump accepted the ovation with remarkable calm. Not the triumphant grin of a winner, but the quiet dignity of a man who has simply spoken the truth he deeply believes. When the applause finally died down, Elizabeth tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Trump," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "we appreciate your openness. But let me ask you one more question that I'm sure many of our viewers are wondering about." She paused, gathering her courage for one last, desperate attack. "You talk about deep connections, loyalty, real values. But how does this fit with your reputation as a businessman who is ready to do anything for profit? A person for whom the deal is more important than principles. Isn't one contradictory?" Trump looked at her for several long seconds, and there was something like compassion in his gaze, as if he saw through her tactics and understood the desperation behind them. "You know, Elizabeth," he said at last, "there is an assumption in your question that I would like to challenge. The assumption that business and personal relationships operate by the same rules. That a man who is tough in negotiations cannot be gentle with those he loves. That someone who values a good deal cannot value loyalty and devotion in his personal life." He shook his head slightly, as if surprised at the limitations of such a view of human nature. As if man is a one-dimensional being who acts the same in all areas of life. But the truth is, we are all multifaceted. A warrior on the battlefield can be the gentlest father at home. A tough businessman can be a loving, faithful husband behind closed doors. A politician who is uncompromising in defending his convictions can be willing to compromise in his personal relationships. This is not a contradiction. It is human complexity. He glanced around the silent studio, and his voice acquired an almost hypnotic power. Not loud, but penetrating straight to the heart of each listener. In a world where everyone tries to put us in comfortable boxes, where everyone must be either completely good or completely bad, real courage is to stand up for your diversity. And that's the courage I see in Melania every day. A woman who refuses to be what the media wants her to be, and who remains true to herself even under the gaze of millions of critical eyes. This is not weakness, as some try to make it out to be. This is the same strength that has built real families, real relationships, real America for centuries. But Elizabeth shook her head, almost unnoticed by the cameras. She had been in the business too long not to know that to go into advertising now would be to admit defeat in the most obvious way possible. Instead, she decided to make one last move, a move of desperation. Mr. Trump, her voice was deceptively soft, which alarmed the experienced interlocutor. Everything you say sounds great, but there is one thing we haven't talked about yet. Trump bowed his head slightly, waiting for him to continue. Many observers have noted a certain coldness in the public relations between you and Melania. That famous moment in Israel when she pulled her hand away, her expression at the inauguration, the separate bedrooms in the White House that many insiders have written about. Doesn't that indicate that there is a very different reality behind the beautiful facade? A heavy silence fell over the studio. It was a low blow, a last-ditch attempt to pierce the armor of calm and dignity that Trump had displayed throughout the interview. You know, Elizabeth, he said finally, his voice surprisingly calm, I expected more from a journalist of your caliber. But instead of asking real questions about politics, economics, the future of our country, you keep returning to tabloid gossip. He paused, and the studio became so quiet you could hear the cameras whirring. You talk about coldness based on a few seconds of video out of thousands of hours of our life together. You mentioned separate bedrooms based on anonymous insider sources whose credibility cannot be verified. You choose to believe a narrative created by people who have never been in our home, never seen us off camera, never knew us as real people. He leaned forward and his voice became deeper, richer, as if he were speaking not just to Elizabeth, but to millions of Americans on the other side of the screen. A murmur of approval ran through the audience. Elizabeth glanced quickly at the audience and was horrified to see that even those who had initially been anti-Trump were now listening attentively, many nodding in agreement. I'm not a politician, I'm a journalist, Elizabeth tried to defend herself. My job is to ask difficult questions. No, Trump said firmly. Your job is to seek the truth, to ask questions that bring us closer to understanding reality, not questions that simply reinforce biased narratives. And you know what the real tragedy of modern journalism is? That professionals like you have forgotten that basic mission. He glanced around the studio, including the cameraman, the lighting technicians, the entire crew creating the show. There was no accusation in his voice, but rather the genuine bewilderment of a man watching the fall of a once great tradition. Instead, we get endless speculation about my marriage, about whether Melania has pulled her hand away at some point or not, about whether she smiles genuinely at public events. Are these really the questions that concern Americans struggling to make ends meet in an economy crippled by inflation? Families who can't afford a home because of sky-high prices? Workers whose jobs are disappearing because of unchecked globalization? As he spoke, his voice gained strength, not volume, but an inner power that made everyone in the studio listen with bated breath. He made a gesture that took in the entire setting of the interview. In Elizabeth's earpiece, Drake's voice was becoming increasingly panicked. Liz, we're losing control. Stop it now. But Elizabeth knew that to stop now would be to admit final defeat. In a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, she decided to approach from a different angle. Mr. Trump, she said, her voice almost accusing, you accuse the media of bias, but weren't you one of the most polarizing presidents in history? Didn't your rhetoric contribute to the divisions we see in this country today? It was an attempt to move the conversation from the personal to the political, where she hoped she had a better chance. Trump accepted the challenge with unexpected calm. He paused, letting his words sink in. I was simply the first to say it directly. To call a spade without politically correct packaging, without euphemisms. And yes, it caused resistance, especially from those who were used to a system that worked for them and not for ordinary Americans. Elizabeth felt her last chance slipping away. Rather than defending himself against charges of polarization, Trump was turning it into a platform for his core political message. a message she knew resonated with millions of Americans, even those who did not consider themselves his supporters. But if we return to the question of media, she tried to redirect the conversation, but Trump gently but firmly interrupted her. "No, let's finish that thought," he said with such authority that Elizabeth couldn't help but pause, because it goes straight to what we were discussing earlier. Values, family, what's really important. He sat up straight in his chair, and there was something almost stately about his posture. The calm confidence of a man who knows exactly what he believes in and why. You know what unites Americans, despite all our differences? A desire for a better life for our children, a yearning for a country where hard work is rewarded, not taxed to death, a belief that our nation can be a beacon of freedom and opportunity for the world, without sacrificing the well-being of our own citizens. His voice grew stronger with each word, not increasing in volume, but becoming more charged with emotion. As he spoke, something remarkable happened in the studio. People began to nod, first cautiously, then with increasing confidence. Elizabeth noticed with alarm that even some of the CNN technical staff, usually sternly neutral, were listening with obvious interest. But there are those who fear that unity. Trump continued, his voice growing quieter, making everyone listen even more intently. Those who thrive on dividing us, who profit from clickbait headlines, from scandals, from manufactured conflicts. And that's why Melania and I have become such easy targets. Because we represent values that cannot be squeezed into convenient ideological boxes that cannot be used to divide. Elizabeth felt control slipping from her grasp. This was no longer an interview. It was a speech directly to the American people through her own program, and there was nothing she could do about it. "Mr. Trump," she made a last desperate attempt. "With all due respect, this is an interview, not a political platform. I'd like to get back to the questions." "About my marriage?" Trump interrupted gently, a glint in his eye that might have been compassion. "About Melania's coldness? About separate bedrooms? Or maybe you have questions about the real issues that concern Americans? About how to stop the inflation that is destroying family budgets? About how to bring back the jobs we have lost because of disastrous trade deals? About how to protect our borders from the flood of drugs that are ruining our children's lives?" There was no aggression in his voice, only a challenge thrown down not so much to Elizabeth as to the entire system she represented. Elizabeth felt sweat beating on her forehead. In her earpiece, Drake was no longer speaking. He was just making inarticulate sounds like the groans of a dying man. She knew she should say something, somehow regain control, but the words were stuck in her throat. Trump took advantage of her silence to address the camera directly, to the millions of Americans on the other side of the screen. "I want to say something directly to those watching us now." His voice deepened, more intimate. "I know many of you are tired of politics that seem increasingly out of touch with reality, tired of a media that is more interested in creating conflict than in finding the truth, tired of a culture that seems to have forgotten the core values this country was built on." He paused briefly, and the studio became so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. "But I want you to know, you are not alone. The values you hold dear, hard work, family, loyalty, patriotism, they are not outdated. They are not primitive. They are not backward. They are eternal. And they are what made America the greatest nation in human history." A wave of applause swept through the studio, tentative at first, then increasingly confident. Elizabeth watched in panic as the audience, carefully selected by CNN producers to create balance, with a noticeable bias toward liberal viewers, now gave Trump a standing ovation. Trump nodded, but it was clear that he, not she, was in control of the moment. "Of course, Elizabeth. But let me say one last thing." He turned to the camera, and his gaze was direct, piercing, as if he was looking into the eyes of every viewer. "This country is at a crossroads. We can continue down the path of division, of policies that enrich the few at the expense of the many, of a culture that mocks traditional values and celebrates their destruction. Or we can return to what has always made America exceptional, the belief that every American, no matter their background, can achieve greatness through hard work, perseverance, and self-belief." His voice, usually harsh and forceful, now sounded with an unexpected softness, almost intimacy. "And you know what's funny? The very values that Melania and I embody in our marriage, loyalty, growth through adversity, mutual support, are the same values that America needs right now. Not cynical calculation, not superficial glamour, but a real deep connection based on mutual respect and shared ideals." The applause in the studio became deafening. Elizabeth watched helplessly as her carefully planned attack turned into her opponent's triumph. When the applause finally died down, Trump turned to her with an unexpectedly warm smile. Thank you for this interview, Elizabeth. Despite our differences, I appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to the American people. And who knows, maybe this is the beginning of a new dialogue. A dialogue based not on biased narratives, but on a genuine desire to understand each other. It was a masterstroke to extend an olive branch at the moment of his complete triumph. Elizabeth felt completely disarmed. That concludes today's edition of American Dialogue, she said woodenly. Thank you, Mr. Trump, for being with us. You're welcome, Elizabeth. Trump nodded with the same calm dignity he had maintained throughout the interview. Michael Drake ran up to her, his face pale with shock. But Elizabeth barely heard him. Her gaze was fixed on Trump, who, despite the crowd surrounding him, somehow maintained a sense of space around him, an aura of calm dignity that seemed impervious to the chaos. Inside the Trump campaign's command center in one of his office buildings, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of staffers gathered around giant screens watched the interview with bated breath, which turned to jubilation when it became clear that their candidate had not just held up, but had turned the tables on him. That was amazing, one of the young strategists exclaimed, looking at the smartphone screen. Social media is just exploding, or your Trump blows CNN and is already trending worldwide. A senior campaign advisor, a seasoned political strategist who had been through dozens of election cycles, shook his head with an expression of almost reverent amazement. In 30 years in politics, I have never seen anything like it, he said quietly. They invited him to stage a public execution, and he turned it into a coronation. In the far corner of the room, slightly removed from the jubilation, stood Jason Miller, one of Trump's closest advisors. Next to him, a young social media analyst quickly scrolled through her tablet. Miller nodded, but his face remained thoughtful. It wasn't just a victory, he said quietly. It was a turning point. They thought they'd catch him out by the contradictions between his public image and his private life. Instead, he showed that the two are inextricably linked, that the same values he champions in politics live in his family. He glanced around the room where the team's jubilation continued. And you know what's most amazing? He didn't say a word that wasn't true. Everything he said about Melania, about his marriage, about his journey, it was real. That's why it worked so powerfully. That's why even the skeptics started listening. The phone in his hand vibrated and a message appeared on the screen, causing his eyebrows to shoot up in surprise. It can't be, he muttered. What's there? The analyst asked. Miller showed her a screen that showed a snippet of a tweet from one of the most prominent liberal commentators. Never thought I'd say this, but Trump just taught us all a lesson in what it means to speak from the heart. No matter your political views, you can't help but respect a man who so passionately defends his family and his beliefs. Melania smiled, that rare, genuine smile that the cameras rarely saw. He's always like this, she said quietly. He just doesn't always show it in public. Her assistant, holding the phone, shook her head with an expression of surprise. Mrs. Trump, the reaction on social media has been incredible. Even platforms that are usually very critical of the president are now full of positive comments. Many women are writing how touched they were by his words about you, about your marriage. Melania nodded, but there was something more in her gaze than just satisfaction with her husband's public success. Some deep personal understanding that was inaccessible to outside observers. Donald has always been a fighter, she said. But today he wasn't just fighting for himself or his political position. He was fighting for us, for what we've built together, for the values we share, despite the world's attempts to divide us. She glanced at the screen where CNN had already begun a post-interview analysis, with commentators barely hiding their shock at how completely the expected narrative had changed. And you know what's most important? Melania continued with the quiet confidence that had always been her hallmark. He told the truth. Not rehearsed, not embellished, but simple human truth. And that's why it resonated so strongly. Inside the CNN studio, where the cameras had been turned off but the chaos was still raging, Elizabeth Montgomery sat motionless in her chair. Michael Drake was frantically on the phone with network executives, trying to minimize the damage from what should have been her triumph, but had turned into a professional disaster. One of the assistants approached her, hesitantly holding out a phone. Miss Montgomery, Mr. Trump would like to see you before he leaves. Elizabeth slowly looked up, as if coming out of a trance. Why? She asked in a lifeless voice. He didn't say. He just asked for a few minutes alone. With the feeling of a man heading to the gallows, Elizabeth stood up and walked across the studio to where Trump, surrounded by his team and an adoring audience, seemed to be creating his own gravitational center in the CNN space. Elizabeth, he said quietly, so that no one but she could hear. I wanted to thank you. She stared at him in complete bewilderment. Thank you? For what? Her voice trembled with barely contained emotion, a mixture of humiliation, anger, and a strange, inexplicable relief, as if the heavy mask she had been wearing for years had finally fallen off. For giving me the opportunity to talk not about politics, not about ratings, but about what's really important, about loyalty, about the power of real relationships, about the values that make America not just great, but truly special. Trump said without malice, without triumphant arrogance, but with some kind of almost paternal concern, which made this moment even more surreal. You know, Elizabeth, there's something much bigger going on in our country right now than just a political struggle. It's a battle for the soul of America, for what values we will live by in the future. And perhaps unwittingly, you have helped millions of people today see that behind all the political hoopla, behind all the scandals and headlines, there is a simple truth, one that every strong American family knows. True strength comes not from power or wealth, but from loyalty to our principles, our country, and those we love.